another stop on kind of a personal campaign I've had this year. This is actually going to be a hybrid kind of talk, part clinical, part Christian, clinical to a Christian audience. How about that? So we're going to talk about some clinical principles as well as some biblical principles toward this topic. So just as a little bit of an overview, we're going to talk about why this topic has become so important to me and why I feel like it's relevant here. We're going to talk about the idea of judgment and the relevance of that with regard to understanding and managing and relating to this. We're going to talk about Christian manhood and why I feel like our decisions and behavior in this area really have everything to do with this topic, okay? Okay, and then we're going to talk about resources, some things that I found helpful that I'd like to relate to you guys that hopefully you'll find helpful too, okay? So, anger. So, as many of you know, I work as a psychotherapist. I think I graduated about 15 or so years ago. I worked in the Department of Youth Services. I work mainly with at-risk youth at first in police stations. I worked with, a lot of angry young men. I'll put it that way. After working that way for a while and doing a little bit of work as a nurse, I went into private practice back in 2010 and started meeting with people individually. And it's still what I do, and I really like it a lot. And it's been an interesting window into life. You know, as I am progressing as a man, as I'm seeing myself and learning myself and sitting with people and hearing their stories, I figured out a couple of things pretty quickly in my practice. One, you figure out your niche. You figure out the kind of issues that you feel most competent to work with, that you enjoy working with, that you're energized by, a population that you like to work with. And I really figured out that I like to work with us, with men who are of a parenting, married age, and kind of working through life because I felt like I could relate to their issues. These are things that I'm also personally trying to study and grow in, how to be a better husband, how to be a better dad, how to grow my character. So I felt like I could connect with the things that I was hearing and that it offered a lot. And then I also realized that in order to kind of work with this population, that one of the major places that someone saw their need to come into a therapy office was through anger. That's where my peers would recognize it. Maybe they've done something to someone that they love that they regretted. Or they were ordered there by their wife. You better go or else. Right? This is very common, most commonly how men would get to the clinical office. And so I really wanted to intentionally prepare myself for that. So I went and sought some anger management training, National Anger Management Association, this training out of New York. And then I also, as a follow-up last year, did a training on domestic violence. And I tell you, it's opened up a whole nother world for me, just in my personal understanding of the topic. Just because as it's combined with scriptures and different things that I've read and pondered on and have listened to and talked about. And so I really want to relate this to you because I feel a sense of a mission now. I feel it really kind of put me on a personal mission, and I'm going to tell you more about that and petition your prayers as we kind of come down to the end of our lesson. Okay, so what we recognize and relate to as anger is really a very primitive, adaptive response. It's very biological. It's fight or flight. These are all the things, it's hard to see the language here, but it's just all different kinds of responses that go on in our body, which we experience as anger. You know, it's a way to ward off a threat. We experience it as a strong feeling of annoyance, displeasure, or hostility. It's physical, it's mental, it's a response to threat or harm done in the past as well as in the present. It takes many different forms, from irritation to blinding rage or resentment that festers over many years. It also has degrees, and those degrees can create the atmosphere for denial, which is a really important part of dealing with this. It's also what you call a secondary emotion. So with the degrees, what I mean by that is I've heard, maybe you heard too, someone say, I wasn't angry, I was frustrated. Mm-hmm. Right? But really what it is it's degrees of the same thing. And being able to own and interact with your anger when it's irritation is really important because you have more more ability to control it. Then you have a better chance of interacting and being able to manage it when it's earlier than when it's later. The higher it gets up to scale is the more difficult it is to rein in. So recognizing it when it's irritation is very important, actually, and being able to acknowledge it. And what I mean by the secondary emotion is anger is triggered by a softer feeling first that we try to fix with anger. We feel threatened. We feel embarrassed. We feel anxious. We feel, so my kid climbs up on something, he falls down, and in my anger, I might say, what are you doing that for? But what I'm feeling is what? I'm feeling anxiety. I'm feeling fear, for my kid that just fell. Or your significant other did something that made you uncomfortable, and you were feeling jealous, and then you kind of, and then it becomes anger, right? It gets expressed as anger, but there's a softer feeling underneath that if you can figure out what that is and communicate that, you're going to create connection rather than separation. We'll talk more about that. So anger has certain short-term functions that are pretty universal. For example, stress release. When we blow up, when we have an episode of rage, often many people express feeling a sense of release. They got it off their chest. It can serve the function of hiding emotional pain, especially because men, we can be socialized that it's not acceptable to say, I'm anxious, I'm sad, I'm jealous, I'm worried, but it can be more socially acceptable to express anger and actually, because you can feel weak and vulnerable sometimes if you express the softer emotion. So it can be a way of hiding emotional pain. It can be a way to get attention. You ever feel like people won't listen to you till you get loud? You ever feel like, I said it twice and you didn't listen to me, so I'm gonna ramp it up because that way you'll listen to me. Right. It can be a way of getting attention. It could similarly be a way to change the behavior of others. We can actually think sometimes it's a parenting tool, right? Yep. That we're supposed to get a little scowl, get a little intimidating, in order to get a child to comply. And then lastly, it could be for revenge or justice. So you've been hurt, you've been offended. So let me do it back to you and let you know how it feels. So how do you like it? Let me get you back now. How do you like it? See, now you know how I feel. Revenge, justice. So these are some of the short-term functions that are associated with anger. But all of these, though they have a short-term benefit, what's the problem? They create disconnection, don't they? They alienate. The long-term consequence is alienation, and that's what we risk by trying to tap into these short-term benefits. So anger, also at the heart, is about judgment. And here's the challenge, is we can't turn our judgment off. It's pretty popular, even kind of a catchphrase, right? Don't judge me. Who you judging, right? Now, but can you really stop judging? Think about it. We are made in the image of God. God is also often referred to as what? The righteous judge. It is, if nothing else, at the core of who he is, God is the judge, ultimately the judge. And of course, you're going to judge when you give your kid off to a babysitter. You're going to judge, where you're going to put your money, what house you're going to buy. You're going to judge, who your kids are going to play with. Those are all judgments. But let's just kind of put it in a biblical context here. So this is a scripture that's referred to as often in this context. It says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. This is true. We don't have an ultimate pronouncement for people. We can't ultimately pronounce whether someone's going to heaven or hell. That's not, that the righteous judge is going to do that. We can try to put people in a box, but we don't know whether or not people are going to change. This guy is just this woman is just that, but we don't know if they're going to grow. We don't know if they're going to change. And he goes on to say in this passage, though, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So we often, when we think about not judging, think that means that you're not going to tell me anything that I do wrong. Don't tell me that anything that I do is wrong. Right? That's right, the context that people usually say it in. But this clearly indicates that that's not the case. That's not what the problem is. Yes, we are supposed to help each other out. We are supposed to be in one another's lives. But here's the key, is have you dealt with your own stuff first? Have you dealt with your own stuff? You come at things from a totally different perspective when you are humble, dealing with your own sin and helping someone else. That's the goal. That's Jesus' goal, that you would deal with your own stuff so that you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. That's the goal. So the challenge with Judgment 2 is distortion. That as men, because we have a sinful nature, our judgment is just skewed. Here's an example, Jonah. So everybody knows the story of Jonah. You know, he was commissioned to go preach to Nineveh, this city in the Assyrian Empire. They were the bad guys. He didn't want to go. He ran far, ended up on a boat, ended up going overboard, ended up being swallowed by a fish, spit out, and then he says, all right, God, I'll go. And then he goes and he preaches, and then what happens? They change. They repented. They actually listened to him. They actually listened to his preaching. And here's what his response was. But Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Oh Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? This is why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than to live." Okay, again, this is his response to their repentance. Do you see the distortion here? Doesn't this really kind of seem off?
Yep.
Right? He's absorbed in his own experience and his feelings, and he wanted to be right more than he wanted these people to be saved, right? And we can get like this. We often get like this, as a matter of fact. So getting a little bit clinical here, there's a whole field, cognitive behavioral therapy, which many probably heard of, and it deals with this idea that when we have thoughts, they create feelings. Those feelings create behavior, and then the behavior reinforces those thoughts. So if we heard, bang, bang, bang outside the window, if you thought it was a gun, you would feel frightened, maybe you duck. If you look out and you see it's only firecrackers, that change in the story changes how you feel and changes your response. Does that make sense? So in the same way, when it comes to the things that make us angry, it's not the event. And to us, it seems obvious that this guy told this kid 3 times. That's why I'm angry. It seems obvious that, it's because, I didn't get my way, or this item's broken, or I got bad service, or I've been waiting for 2 hours. It's obvious that this is why I'm angry. But not really. It's not the event. It's the story we tell ourselves about the event. It's how we interpret that event. It's how we describe it to ourselves. If we describe it as disrespect, guess what? You're going to feel angry. And the challenge is that kind of distortion, like what happened with Jonah, really happens with us a lot. And here's some more specific examples. So this field of cognitive behavioral therapy identified common examples of where this happens in people. For example, all or nothing thinking, sometimes called black and white thinking. If I'm not perfect, I failed. Right? Either I do right or not at all, and this little picture here is saying that there's no gray. It's either black or it's white. Here's a big one, overgeneralizing, seeing a pattern based upon a single event, being overly broad in conclusions we draw. You always do this. You never do that. You never listen to me. Right? Where, when you're really honest, of course there's exceptions. Things like jumping to conclusions. You text someone and they don't text you back and you think they're mad. They're not talking to me. And then you find out their phone died. Or it was in the car.
Happened to me yesterday.
Right? Happened yesterday? That's funny.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We jump to conclusions. You see a look on someone's face and you interpret it a certain way. Oh, they don't like me. Oh, we're not getting along. We just don't click. Jumping to conclusions. Labeling. That's a big one that goes with anger. Is when we reduce someone down to a certain label, to a certain quality. The person that cut you off is an idiot. Right? And then, obviously other epithets can come inside your head. Right? These kind of things, these kind of thinking errors, they drive our anger, and what we can do, what we can learn to do, is to challenge them. Is it really always Is it really never? Is it really ruin? This is a big one here too. Magnification of catastrophizing, blowing things out of proportion, or inappropriately shrinking something to make it seem less important. So that could be, you get a scratch on your phone and you say, oh, it's ruined. See what you did? It'll never work again, right? Or, you know, you lose it and, you know, you have an anger episode and you say, you know what, I just got a little irritated. Either, you know, we take things out to the wrong proportion. So these are all some of the stories that we can tell ourselves. But this is very, when you think about it, it's very scriptural. Think about how many scriptures talk about the mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You know, talk about taking every thought captive, you know, and making it a prisoner to making it obedient to Christ. You think about in Philippians 4, in the context of talking about anxiety, you know, it talks about, you know, don't be anxious at anything, by everything by prayer and petition. Then it goes on to say whatever is true, noble, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy. Think about these things. God directs us to rein in our thinking. God gives us his word. He gives us the Bible in order to rein in our thinking, which changes our feelings, which changes our behavior.
Amen.
Right? So, judgment, the challenge with it is it's ours. Like in James 1, my dear brothers, take note of this, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, for a man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. So God gets angry, and obviously I've heard many excuse their anger because God gets angry. But the difference between our anger and God's is that his judgment is perfect. His judgment is not skewed. Ours is. Right? That's a challenge there. And anger, and really it's not the feeling that is wrong, it's the choices that we make with it. It's the aggression. Aggression is behavior that's intended to hurt somebody, verbal or physical. Or hostility, which is an attitude of anger, where we, you know, we're rejecting somebody, we catch, you know, we roll our eyes, we, you know, who does that? You know? Hostility and aggression are the problem. Anger actually can be a very mobilizing emotion if it's directed at sin, if it's directed at the devil, if it's directed, you know, toward a righteous cause. Similarly here in 2 Timothy, you know, again, kind of as we alluded to before, it talks about God being the righteous judge. The Lord being the righteous judge. That's the difference between him and us, is he is perfect, and his judgment is perfect, and he is the righteous judge. But we're all judges. That's the challenge. And this is where we get our anger from. And the more we do it, is the more angry we are. Right? But directing it at not a person, not labeling a person, but at a behavior, at an attitude, is what we need to do. So, talk a little bit about Christian manhood here. So, ran across some interesting research when it came to men and anger. Let's read this together. So, this 2015 research study by Julia Dahl and colleagues from Penn State University found that when masculinity was challenged, men reacted with more anger, with an increased endorsement of social dominance over women. Basically, they asked men to take a test on gender knowledge with questions about stereotypically masculine or feminine content. Half of the participants were told, whether it was true or not, that they scored more like the average woman than like the average man. Then they completed a series of questionnaires on anger and other beliefs. Men who had their masculinity threatened were angrier, more scared of having their scores made public, and endorsed a greater desire for social dominance over women. Interesting thing about this is there's a high correlation between rigid views about gender and specifically domestic violence even actually. So I had taken a class in graduate school. I'll never forget this. This professor had done research in a prison with violent offenders and did these personality profiles. And one of the things that came up consistently was rigid views of gender. What it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman is very highly correlated with us feeling threatened about our manhood, and out of that shame, out of that anxiety, reacting. So we really think our manhood is easily threatened. Here's another interesting study with regard to this. Masculinity is also related to right-wing authoritarian attitudes. So According to a 2014 study from Bradley Goodnight and colleagues at Georgia State University, different dimensions of masculinity are predictive of right-wing authoritarian attitudes, anti-gay anger. 3 dimensions in particular were relevant: status, a belief that men should be respected and project an air of confidence; toughness, a belief that men should be physically tough and aggressive; and anti-femininity, a belief that men should avoid stereotypically feminine activities. All 3 were correlated with right-wing authoritarianism, sexual prejudice, and anti-gay aggression. And so, again, the rigidness in how we view ourselves and women, the great thing about Jesus, and this is why I think we're really blessed and have a special role, I think, to play in the world, is we get to follow the consummate man who had the best qualities of a woman as well as the best qualities of a man, who is absolutely strong but wouldn't, a bruised reed he wouldn't break. He wouldn't cry out aloud in the streets. And that's the model that we get to follow. Yep. And yet we can kind of, tend towards stereotypical things. We can be pulled by the culture towards stereotypes, and this is what we got to really be careful of. And and it's funny when I hear, language like the right-wing authoritarian, it really reminds me, in my mind, it triggers what the world thinks about Christian men. And actually, the next one I think even is more overt about that. Or no, I didn't put the other one in there. But that they associate, especially in the current culture, these values of conservatism and being right-wing, and not whether or not that's truly you, it's what they associate us with. I mean, can you relate to that? If you talk to somebody, let's say, who is not of that, do you find them assuming that you think that way, even if that's not how you think? Have anybody ever experienced that? And this is where I think we got to really be mindful that the world is watching us. And are we angry, and are we rejecting, and are we demeaning of other people? Like, just say, like, for example, the anti-gay aggression. Now, obviously, this isn't an endorsement of the lifestyle, but those are God's children. Those men who have that attraction are still God's children. Yep. Or a woman. And so that is still not condoned in God's eyes. And so thinking about who we are on the world stage, I think, is really important, which leads me to my final point here about this part, is peace. There's a lot, if you ever notice, in the Bible that calls us as Christians to be people of peace. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. Yep. Think about how much in that is about managing conflict. Things like, blessed are the peacemakers. Things like, if someone strikes you in the cheek, turn the other cheek also. Yep. Things like where it says, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I tell you, if you've been angry with your brother, you're in danger of breaking the law, however it says. So there's a lot in there that, as Jesus is laying out his new world order here, as he's taking people from the letter of the law to the covenant of the Spirit, he is calling us to be people of peace. There's a lot in there that does that. Here's the one that really grabbed me recently. Jesus sends out the 72, and he gives them these instructions. He says, when you enter a house, first say peace to this house. And he said, if a man of peace is there, your peace will rest on him. If not, it will return. If a man of peace is there. And in another text, it talks about shaking the dust off your feet. That house is being judged by what? Whether there's a man of peace there. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. And so I think it even falls, even though a lot of this can apply to anybody, I want to make a special appeal to us that we have a special role with how we manage this and how it affects the world around us. Think about the call of an elder, which is biblical model of leadership. An elder must be blameless, the husband of but one wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer is entrusted with God's work, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain, etc. So specifically, the Bible holds this up as an essential quality of this leadership role. And I think it does it too, and you hear me reference this a lot because it's really been on my heart here the past few years. This is how the Old Testament ends. It says, see, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the children, parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents. And actually, The new NIV said parents, but the word is ab, A-B, where we get Abba. It's fathers. It's not parents. I think it just got neutralized for the culture, but the word is A-B. And or else I'll come and strike the land with total destruction or a curse. Makes me think about the societal ramifications of fatherlessness today, right? About half of all children not growing up in the presence of their father because of divorce, because maybe they never married as single parents. About half, and many societal problems can be attributed. Here's a great example. The book Bringing Up Boys, James Dobson, maybe some of you have read it. They tell a story about a prison that ran a program on Mother's Day getting cards for the inmates. And so they brought all these cards for the inmates. Hundreds of them responded, wrote cards, sent them out to their moms. Great success. So what did they do? They decided that they wanted to repeat the program for Father's Day. Guess what happened?
Right.
No one showed up. Not one. No one showed up.
Wow.
What's the correlation there? Prison. Fatherlessness. Right? Similarly, so that was signaling the coming of the gospel. That was the end of the Old Testament. Beginning of the New Testament. This is Zechariah is being told about John the Baptist going to be baptized. He goes into the temple to give the sacrifice, and he tells him he's going to have a son in his old age. And he tells him he will go before the Lord in the spirit of the power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, turn the hearts of the parents to their children. So there's a connecting of hearts that's an essential part of the gospel, is the point I'm trying to make here. Obviously, that's what John was preaching. That's what was being predicted in him. And this is where I think it really comes back to us. Because this whole turning away thing, absolutely it happens if you don't live in the same house. But you know what? It can happen when you are living in the same house, can't it? It can happen while you're parenting your kids, can't it? And I think anger, especially for us, can be a prime culprit. And anger doesn't have to be loud and demonstrative. It could be seething. It could be irritation. It could be just a coldness. I think it has a lot to do with our kids' ability to respond to the gospel. That there's a turning of their hearts to us specifically. And again, it got kind of twisted to the parents. The word was Ab, Father. The turning of the hearts of the children to their father and the father to their children. We have an essential role to play through managing our anger. So, a couple of interventions. So if you were to go about managing your anger, there's a few things that should happen. You want to learn to recognize it earlier, de-escalate it when you recognize it, transform that anger to assertive communication, because remember that softer feeling thing I talked about underneath? Learning how to communicate about that and get that point across and even say, I'm very angry right now. I'm feeling very frustrated. But there's an assertive way to do it versus an aggressive way to do it. So you should speak. And then develop insight into underlying causes. Sometimes it's the result of an earlier injury that we've carried over time and has made us more explosive. There are certain alarms in our psyche that we can learn to recognize. Events are situations that tend to be more sensitive, usually associated with shame. Shame, is this fear of disconnection that we all carry. It's a byproduct of the fall. Biblically, it's Adam and Eve. They sinned. They covered up with the fig leaf and they went and hid because they didn't want to be found by God. But in some way, we all do that. We hide a certain element of who we are. If anybody ever found out this about my past, this about my private habits, this about my body, this about I don't want people to know how much I make, I don't want people to know how much I live, because all these things, because of our fear of judgment, it makes us hide. And when we get a white hot light shined on that, when we get exposed, it can create these intense dynamics, these intense situations, like a red flag situation. Triggers are more common situations, like traffic maybe. And then there's this idea of cues, which are signs in our body, physical, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, that our anger is escalating. Physical cues are responses in our body, like our heart beating fast, breathing heavier, things that are physiological signs of the fight and flight. Behavioral things are habits that we have. Maybe it's pacing, maybe it's talking with your hands, maybe, I knew a guy that used to rearrange things when he started to get angry. My kids told me I purse my lips when I'm annoyed. I do this. My wife said I flip my hands in traffic when I'm annoyed at the person in front of me, right? We all have habits, and if you want to know, ask your kids. They know exactly what your habits are, and your all significant others. Emotional cues are some of the soft emotions, like embarrassment sometimes can, lead to anger often. And then cognitive cues are things that go on inside your head, like where you start. Certainly, if you're cursing inside of your head, if you're repeating the offense. I can't believe he did that. He should have known better than that. And fantasizing also can be one way. You're picturing, doing something to somebody. Those are all cognitive cues. So once you recognize these cues, you want to move into a strategy. Generally speaking, and I'm sensitive to our time here, you have immediate strategies and you have preventative strategies. Immediate strategies are things used in the moment to de-escalate the crisis, something like a timeout, something like, maybe doing like a game on your phone or whatever. They interface with your body physiologically. They must be executed early and become habitual to be effective. Preventative strategies are a little longer-term lifestyle interventions. They work over time through a process of developing your character and also associated with maturing you as a person, making you more like Jesus. Examples of immediate strategies are here. Things like, and breathing is one that actually, you can underestimate the power of it. It actually has a lot to do with our physiology. Like when our heart starts beating fast, it's our fight or flight, trying to get more oxygen in. And deep breathing, as simple as it is, can do a lot to de-escalate our body. And cognitive strategies would be things that you tell yourself. You coach yourself rather than listening to yourself. So listening to yourself, you hear a shaming voice, and when you talk to yourself, you can coach yourself down. And then you have preventative strategies, which are more long-term lifestyle things, like having more exercise, playing connection with your significant other. You might notice sometimes in your relationship with your significant other, when you don't get time, how things can get edgy. So you plan connection. That's what that's about. Reading, which puts positive thoughts in your mind. Time management, because often being late can be a trigger that makes traffic totally different, doesn't it? When you're running 5 minutes behind, 10 minutes behind. Financial stress, budgeting, being in counseling, being in a 12-step group. So these are some books that I found helpful. Crucial Conversations is about being assertive speaking. It gives you it guides you through a process of talking when your feelings are elevated or when there's a lot at stake. This one, Peacemaker, is all about conflict resolution. It's a deeply biblical read. It's kind of dense for that reason, but if you want to do a good biblical study about conflict resolution, that book was good. So the guy that wrote it, he's a lawyer by profession and like an elder in his church, and goes to mediate major conflicts in different organizations. He's a conflict mediator in different situations. What's that?
No, I'm just repeating the title.
Yep, Peacemaker. And then Gary Chapman, famous for 5 love languages, he wrote a book about managing anger, a good, practical Christian approach to it. And this is written by a brother, What About Your Anger? And what he does actually is it's also pretty dense as a read, but you can almost use it more like a handbook. And he does this great list of studies about the differences between God's anger and man's anger. So like he talks, God's anger is slow. It's contained, it's deliberate, it's planned. And he has all these different qualities about God's anger, and then he has like scriptural studies of those qualities, and then he talks about the difference between that and man's anger. And this is the problem with our anger, and he takes you through those. So it's one of those that you would study out over time, and it would kind of guide you into a lot of scriptures. He also references Gary Chapman's book a lot in guiding through it. Okay, so I think this campaign thing, if I could kind of leave you with this. So last year, I had gone to this training to help develop a domestic violence group, a veterans intervention group. And the training was started off by a woman who, a middle-aged woman, had a professional in the Boston area. She had decided that after 20 years of being married that she wanted to be divorced. She told her husband. They had 4 kids, and she said, I was really surprised about how well he took it. He went about living they went about living their life. And the husband used to take their kids to school in the morning, and as a habit. And on this one particular day, they would usually yell goodbye from the front door. The husband said, go upstairs and say goodbye to your mom. I don't want you doing that down here. And the woman telling the story said, I thought it was odd because they never do that. But, I said, goodbye, honey. And it was because on that day he had decided that he was going to take her life. So he drops the kids off at school. He comes home and says, honey, I was at the chiropractor yesterday. He showed me this technique that really relaxed my neck. I want to show you. And had her sit down on the side of the bed. And because there's some younger guys here, I probably shouldn't go too much more detail. But he attempted to break her neck. She didn't die. She falls on the ground. Now he attempts to choke her, right? And then she still didn't die. Now he's up and he's pacing, and then she manages to persuade him in such a way that she could get away. So she lived. He got to the police station before she did. Oh, by the way, he was a Homeland Security officer. He was a military veteran, Special Forces. He was connected. He got a good lawyer. He pled it down from attempted murder to something much less. And at the time of our lesson last year, he was out, visiting with his kids every other weekend. They weren't together, obviously, but he's free to date somebody else. So what that made me think, one, it was crazy, obviously eerie, dark. I felt the darkness in the room. His kids were the same age as mine, and I'm just trying to think, how could someone get to the point of saying, doing this to someone that you once loved? He asked someone that you're married to, you had shared a life with, and having things get to this point, and how is this even possible? And then to think that this man not only did this there, he has the potential to do it again and again and again, if he's not stopped. And it made me think about what we have here and just what we have in terms of healthy manhood and how we can pass it on.
Yeah, right.
And how we can pass it on. Men don't have this. Nope. I think that's just what I'm really struck by when I sit with people, that they do not have people that they could talk to and help them through things. But I would really love to create that. I think it's a part of my professional work. And what I just want to petition your prayers. I want to create this Batters Intervention group, anger management groups, healthy fathering group, to kind of walk men back from wherever they are in their darkness to health. Kind of on the other side of this too, as a part of this training, I'm sorry I'm going a little long here. As a part of this training, we sat in on some Batters Intervention groups out here in this Cambridge area. And so you kind of get to hear different kinds of stories. And there was another gentleman who came into the house drunk, scuffled with his wife, or somebody's trying to get in the fridge. She falls, she hits her head, she's bleeding, and he got charged. And the group moderator had been asking him about his wife and all these things that she did to serve him and his family. And as a result of the questions that he asked, he said, your wife is really a good woman, isn't she? And he goes, that's why I'm here. Right? And so I think there's a range of men out there and their needs. And I think we can understand as Christian men brokenness without casting judgment on the person. We know brokenness. And I think what I see out there in the world, especially people that deal with men in this situation, is they drop them in, they label them, drop them in a box. They're broken beyond repair, lock them up, put them away. But that doesn't necessarily fix it. They still got to get out at some point. So I would petition your prayers with this, that I think we have a role to play just in our example, being authentic Christian men, being men of peace, that world is watching us specifically for how we handle conflict, and then I really praying that we can make some inroads in just helping people that are even further down the road from us. But amen, guys. Thank you.
All right,
guys. So it's like 10 after. I don't know if you guys want to stay a little bit longer. I mean, I know other people, you might have Bible studies right now to go to, or D groups or something like that. But if you wanted to stay, I was wondering if you'd be willing maybe to stay a little bit longer and answer some questions maybe, or get some dialogue. I think this is that's
excellent.
That's an excellent talk, but I'd hate to just, I don't really even want to walk out right now and be like, all right, see you later, because it stirs up things in me as well. And then the other part is, I don't know about you, but like when my wife comes to church on Wednesday night, when does your wife come home? You come home, she's here like 10:30 or something. I'm like, their church is like 3 hours. Ours is like, like, hey, I gotta go. Their socks are on. So don't feel compelled to stay. Although I would encourage you to stay, because I think a lot can come out of us just talking for a little bit here. I know some of us have our D groups. If you wanted to break up into your D group right now, that could be helpful as well, just to continue this dialogue and things like that. But does anybody have any questions for Rondey? Maybe, go ahead, Chris.
I just wanted to say I'm finishing up a book right now called The Sons of the Father, and it keys in on a lot of the points.
On this idea, I'd be interested in that book.
Yeah, I was given it from a disciple, but it talks about how it's a Christian context. The author is not with our church, but he is a Christian author, and it talks about how the relationship that we have with God, how the problems with that and other relationships in our life, including wives and everything else, come from this what's called fatherhood.